Act 1. The Abyss of Whitechapel. In the late Victorian era, London was the heart of the largest empire the world had ever known. It was a city of immense wealth, of scientific progress, and of imperial grandeur. But beneath the veneer of gaslit sophistication and industrial might, there existed another London, a dark, sprawling, and destitute abyss teeming with the forgotten and the damned. This was the East End, and its most notorious district was Whitechapel. In the autumn of 1888, Whitechapel was more than just a slum. It was a living nightmare, a labyrinth of narrow, unlit alleyways, reeking of coal smoke, gin, and human misery. Overcrowded tenements leaned against each other, blocking out the sun. Here, life was a brutal, daily struggle for survival, and for a handful of women forced to sell their bodies on the streets to afford a meal or a bed for the night, this struggle was about to intersect with new, unimaginable horror. For into this abyss, a shadow had descended, a phantom of pure malevolence who would stalk the gaslit streets, armed with a knife and a chilling purpose. He would be given a name by a frenzied press, a name that would echo through history as the very embodiment of unsolved evil. Jack the Ripper. To understand the terror that gripped London, one must first understand the world of his victims. They were not just names in a cold case file. They were daughters, mothers, and sisters trapped by poverty, addiction, and circumstance in the most dangerous profession of the era. They were women like Mary and Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman, women in their 40s, their lives worn down by hardship. They were part of a desperate community known as the Unfortunates, living hand-to-mouth, moving between squalid lodging houses and the cold, unforgiving streets. Their world was one of constant vulnerability, a world where violence was common, but the kind of methodical, monstrous violence that was about to be unleashed was something new, something alien. The terror began on August 31st, 1888. In the pre-dawn darkness, a car driver on his way to work discovered the body of Polly Nichols in a dark gateway on Bucks Row. At first, it may have seemed like just another tragic death in a district where life was cheap. But when the police surgeon arrived, the true horror of the crime became apparent. Her throat had been slit with 2 deep cuts, and her abdomen had been brutally mutilated with a series of jagged incisions. The attack was savage, yet there was a chilling precision to it that suggested something more than a simple, violent rage. The police were baffled. There was no clear motive, no witnesses, and the killer had vanished into the labyrinthine streets of Whitechapel like a ghost. Just over a week later, on September 8th, the killer struck again. The body of Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The ferocity of the attack had escalated dramatically. Like Polly Nichols, her throat had been severed, but this time the mutilations were far more severe. The killer had disemboweled her, and her uterus had been surgically removed from her body and taken from the crime scene. The news sent a shockwave of terror through the East End. This was not random violence. This was the work of a monster with a specific, grotesque purpose. The press, sensing a sensational story, began to whip the public into a frenzy. They dubbed the unknown assailant the Whitechapel Murderer. But a new, more enduring name was about to be born from the killer's own hand. The Phantom was about to give himself a voice. Act 2, the double event and the birth of a legend. The autumn of 1888 became known as the Autumn of Terror. The residents of Whitechapel lived in a state of constant, paralyzing fear. The streets, once filled with the noise of late-night commerce and drunken revelry, felt eerily silent after dark. Vigilante groups formed, patrolling the alleyways, their members armed with sticks and clubs. The police presence was massive, with hundreds of officers, both in uniform and plain clothes, flooding the district. But the killer remained elusive, a ghost in their midst. And on the night of September 30th, he would demonstrate his utter contempt for their efforts in the most audacious and terrifying way possible. That night, He would kill not once, but twice in what would become known as a double event. His first victim of the night was Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish immigrant known as Long Liz. Her body was discovered at around 1 a.m. in Dutfield's Yard, a dark, cobblestone alley off Burner Street. Her throat had been cut, but unlike the previous victims, there were no other mutilations. The police surgeon believed that the killer had been interrupted. A man driving a small cart had entered the yard just moments after the murder, and it's believed his arrival startled the killer, forcing him to flee before he could complete his gruesome ritual. The Ripper, his bloodlust unfulfilled, was now loose on the streets, angry and looking for another victim. He did not have to look for long. Less than an hour later, and less than a mile away, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square, a small, dark square located within the boundaries of the City of London, a separate police jurisdiction. This was a direct challenge, a taunt to a different police force. The attack on Eddowes was one of the most savage of all. Her throat was slit, her face was horrifically mutilated, and her abdomen was ripped open. Her left kidney and a major part of her uterus had been removed and taken by the killer. The precision of the organ removal led many, including the police surgeon, to believe that the killer possessed significant anatomical or surgical knowledge. Just a short walk from the Mitre Square crime scene, another clue was found. A piece of Catherine Eddowes' blood-soaked apron was discovered in the doorway of a tenement building on Golston Street. Above it, scrawled in chalk on the wall, was a cryptic message. The jewels are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Was this a genuine clue from the killer, an attempt to incite anti-Semitic sentiment, or was it a red herring? The police commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, worried about a potential riot, ordered the message to be washed away before it could be properly photographed, a decision that has been criticized by historians for centuries. In the days following the double event, the panic in London reached a fever pitch. The killer was no longer just a murderer. He was a phantom, a boogeyman who could kill with impunity, even with the entire city on high alert. It was during this period of intense media frenzy that a letter arrived at the Central News Agency. It was written in red ink, and it began with the words, "Dear Boss." The author taunted the police for their incompetence and promised to continue his work. He wrote, "I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled." He ended the letter with a new, chilling moniker. He signed it, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." The press published the letter, and the name, with its sharp, violent sound, captured the public imagination. The Whitechapel murder was gone. Jack the Ripper had arrived. Act 3, The Ripper's final act and the letters from hell. The Dear Boss letter, whether a genuine communication from the killer or a cruel hoax, transformed the case. Jack the Ripper was now a household name, a media-created supervillain. The name itself seemed to give the killer a new level of confidence, a new persona to inhabit. A flood of copycat letters inundated the police and newspapers, but a few stood out for their chilling authenticity. One was a postcard, also written in what appeared to be blood, that referenced a double event before it was public knowledge. It was also signed, Jack the Ripper. The psychological game between the killer and the city escalated. He was no longer just a physical threat. He was a voice whispering from the abyss, a master of psychological terror. The most infamous and disturbing of all the communications arrived in October. It was a small package addressed to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Inside the box was half of a human kidney, preserved in alcohol. The package was accompanied by a letter written in a barely literate scrawl. It began with the words, "From Hell." The author of the From Hell letter claimed to have fried and eaten the other half of the kidney. "It was very knees," he wrote. He ended with the promise, "Catch me when you can." The kidney was examined by a doctor, who determined it was indeed a human kidney, likely from a woman who had been a heavy drinker, a description that fit Catherine Eddowes. from whom a kidney had been taken. The From Hell letter, with its cannibalistic boast and its physical proof, is considered by most experts to be the only truly authentic communication from the killer. It was a direct taunt, a piece of his victim sent to the very men who were trying to hunt him down. It was an act of supreme, malevolent arrogance. After a month of terrifying silence, Jack the Ripper committed his final and most gruesome murder. On the morning of November 9th, 1888, a rent collector was sent to the small, single room of Mary Jane Kelly, a 25-year-old woman who was, by all accounts, the most beautiful of the victims. When she didn't answer the door, he peered through a broken window pane. The sight that greeted him was a scene of almost unimaginable butchery, a vision from hell itself. Mary Kelly had been utterly eviscerated. The murder had taken place indoors, giving the killer hours to indulge his most depraved fantasies without fear of interruption. Her body was a grotesque jigsaw puzzle of human anatomy. Her organs were draped around the room, her heart taken from the crime scene. The mutilations were so extreme that her face was unrecognizable. It was the work of a man who had descended completely into madness and bloodlust. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly was the Ripper's magnum opus, a final, horrific crescendo to his symphony of terror. And then, as mysteriously as he had first appeared, he vanished. The murder stopped. The letters ceased. Jack the Ripper, after his final horrific act, simply disappeared, leaving behind a city in shock, a police force in disgrace, and a mystery that would endure for all time. Act 4. The endless hunt for a ghost. The investigation into the Whitechapel murders was the largest and most complex manhunt of its time. Scotland Yard was faced with an unprecedented challenge. Forensic science was in its infancy. There was no fingerprinting, no DNA analysis. The investigation relied on old-fashioned shoe-leather detective work, interviewing thousands of people, following up on hundreds of leads, and trying to find a pattern in the chaos. The police were overwhelmed. Whitechapel was a perfect hunting ground for a killer. It was a warren of dark, unmappable alleyways, with a transient population where people appeared and disappeared without notice. The killer seemed to be a local, someone who knew the geography of the abyss intimately, who knew how to melt into the shadows and vanish in an instant. Despite the difficulties, the police did develop a profile of their man. They believed he was a solitary figure, likely suffering from periods of intense, homicidal rage. The surgical precision of some of the mutilations led to the theory that he might be a doctor, a surgeon, or a butcher, someone with anatomical knowledge and skill with a knife. This led to a wave of suspicion falling on the medical community, with doctors and medical students being secretly investigated. Over the years, the list of potential suspects has grown to over 100, a gallery of ghouls that includes everyone from impoverished locals to members of the royal family. But a few names have consistently remained at the top of the list for ripperologists: the amateur and professional historians who have dedicated their lives to solving the case. One of the most prominent suspects, favored by many senior police officials at the time, was Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a barrister and schoolteacher from a good family who was found drowned in the River Thames in December 1888, shortly after the final murder. His own family believed he was the killer, and his suicide was seen as a confession of guilt. The timing of his death is certainly suspicious, but there is no direct evidence linking him to any of the crimes. Another leading candidate, particularly in recent years, is Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. He was a paranoid schizophrenic with a known hatred of women, and he was institutionalized in an asylum in 1891. A chief constable at the time wrote in his memoirs that a suspect had been identified and was a Polish Jew who lived in the heart of the murder district, a description that fits Kosminski perfectly. In 2014, an author claimed to have proven Kosminski's guilt through DNA analysis a shawl said to belong to Catherine Eddowes. However, the scientific validity of this DNA evidence has been heavily disputed by experts, and the claim remains controversial. Then there is George Chapman, another Polish immigrant who was a surgeon's assistant. He was convicted and executed in 1903 for poisoning 3 of his wives. Inspector Frederick Aberline, one of the lead investigators on the Ripper case, reportedly told the officer who arrested Chapman, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." Chapman certainly had the medical skills and the misogynistic rage, but his method of killing, poison, was vastly different from the Ripper's brutal use of a knife. The list goes on and on. There was Walter Sickert, a famous artist who some believe had clues to his guilt in his dark, atmospheric paintings of the London underworld. There was even a theory that the killer was actually a woman, a Jill the Ripper, perhaps a crazed midwife. Each suspect comes with their own tantalizing set of clues, their own compelling narrative. But each case is ultimately built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence and speculation. The ghost has, so far, eluded every attempt to give him a definitive name. Act 5, The Unending Legacy of Terror. The Whitechapel murders of 1888 were more than just a series of brutal crimes. They were a social and cultural turning point. The case threw a harsh, unforgiving spotlight on the horrific poverty and social conditions of the East End. The world was forced to confront the reality of the London abyss, a reality that had been conveniently ignored by the wealthy elite. The sensational press coverage, while often irresponsible, did lead to social reforms and a greater awareness of the plight of the poor. But the primary legacy of Jack the Ripper is one of fear and fascination. He was, in many ways, the first modern serial killer. He was not a monster who killed for money or revenge. He was a psychological predator who seemed to kill for the sheer pleasure of it. He was an urban phantom, a product of the anonymity and alienation of the modern industrial city. He proved that a monster could walk among us, completely unseen. His use of the media was revolutionary. By writing letters and giving himself a name, he created his own dark brand, his own terrifying legend. He turned his crimes into a public spectacle, making the entire city his unwilling audience. This template, the taunting, media-savvy killer, has been copied by countless murders in the century that followed, from the Zodiac Killer to the Son of Sam. The question that continues to haunt us is, why was he never caught? Was it because he was a brilliant criminal genius who outsmarted the police at every turn? Or was it simply a case of being in the right place at the right time? A killer operating in a pre-forensic era, in a city that was a perfect hiding place, his crimes targeting a population that society had already abandoned. The truth is likely a combination of all these factors. Today, the legend of Jack the Ripper is stronger than ever. He is a permanent fixture in our popular culture, a historical boogeyman who represents a dark, unknowable side of human nature. The case remains an open wound, a puzzle that continues to attract new generations of detectives, both amateur and professional. It is the ultimate cold case, a story that has no ending. But as we obsess over the identity of the killer, it is crucial to remember the women whose lives he stole. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They were not just pawns in a killer's game or names in a history book. They were human beings, whose tragic deaths serve as a chilling reminder of a time when a shadow fell over London, a shadow that has never truly lifted. Jack the Ripper is more than a man. He is a question, and it is a question that, in all likelihood, will never be answered.